think to begin with anything other than a look at this game's name would be a disservice to it. In Europe, where this game was initially developed, it was called LittleBigAdventure, Twinsen's Adventure. The use of adventure twice in the title makes it seem a little clunky. It really has no way of rolling off the tongue. Now this is just the initial release for DOS in 1994, when the game was published by EA, when they were the quirky indie upstart instead of the nightmare mega corporation. In the US, EA figured the game would flop, probably rightfully so, who in a desperate attempt to make the weird, goofy game cool, renamed it Relentless, Twinsen's Adventure, which is a marked improvement over the original name on lingual flow alone, and it apparently didn't sell too well. Despite this, the game made it to Japan on 3 systems, the PC-98 and FM Towns, 2 Japanese computers, and the PlayStation. You could really convert anything to that damn console. This version is decently obscure as it was Japan and Europe exclusive, but it does control fairly well, apparently. I assume that, as it probably uses the same control scheme that the PC version controller does. In 2014, the game hit mobile, which I imagine is completely miserable, and the year after hit Steam and Good Old Games on PC, modernized and updated a bit, primarily in controller support, which was a surprisingly decent way to play the game, as LittleBigAdventure Classic. Recent update, as of a fairly new patch, the game has been renamed on Steam and Good Old Games again to Twinsen's LittleBigAdventure Classic, and now includes an advertisement for the upcoming LittleBigAdventure 3. I largely bring all this up out of necessity, because for something so obscure, this little game has clung on to life in a myriad of odd forms, which is more than can be said for most games of its style and era, especially ones that were mostly brought about from Europe. So what is LittleBigAdventure? That's a tougher question, and its list of names is complicated. While utilizing the framework, pacing, and many elements of adventure games, open-world inventory puzzles, it also lacks many of them. The game is real-time, it's not point-and-click, it has combat plus platforming. It's an odd blend of everything laid on top of an adventure game base. Adventure games definitely aren't my thing. The only one I've ever beaten before this was Grim Fandango, so I'm kind of stumbling into this genre headfirst in a very, very strange game that is both very accessible and also very inaccessible in a lot of ways. There's a lot going on, and I'm not sure how my experience is going to live up to people who are a lot more familiar with the genre than me. Unlike the average adventure game, LittleBigAdventure forgoes traditional mouse controls and largely avoids the menuing and inventory puzzles of its contemporaries, although they are still there to some extent. Instead, the game is an open-world, 3D, isometric adventure game with platforming, combat, stealth, a little of everything, really. One universal thing is that it controls bad might be harsh, but it's certainly a acquired taste. Isometric is one thing. Isometric tank controls with R as the move forward button on controllers is another, especially when the game asks you to align precisely for platforming or using your weapon, the magic ball. On the first point, the protagonist, Twinsen, has 4 modes of movement, all of them awful for a variety of reasons. Normal movement is very, very slow and has no unique properties. The speed also affects the rotational speed, as you only have the option to walk forward or rotate, so it can be used for precise turns to an extent. But rotation also has acceleration. If you lightly tap to try to adjust subtly, you won't rotate, which makes it potentially even more useless than some of the other forms. The cost of trying to make detailed animation for the time, I suppose. Aggressive is the melee combat form in which Twinsen can hold down the attack button to punch and kick enemies, while also being moderately faster. But let me tell you, melee combat is awful. You hold the button and pray, while Twinsen wildly flails about, usually directly into lethal attacks from enemies, who almost all have some kind of ranged attack, and who kill you extremely fast. Getting the attention of any 2 enemies is basically instant death, especially because knockback always moves you the opposite direction you're facing in this game. Often, for no reason, bullets kinda just pull you into more, and with next to no invulnerability, it's pretty much over. You try to run away, you just get sucked back in. You try to run towards them, you get pushed away. There's no winning when it comes to getting attacked. You're almost always better off using the magic ball, and that's its own entire thing. Okay, but surely discreet the stealth mode is good. It's even slower than normal mode, but it actually does have a function, in that enemies not looking at you won't detect you, and therefore won't kill you in seconds. Although it's so slow that it's essentially only used in scripted sequences, and therefore it is useful, but situationally, and it is excessively tedious to use. The only form that isn't abhorrently slow is athletic. While in this form, Twinsen actually runs and can jump for horrible, difficult-to-aim isometric platforming, sometimes under a timer. Not only that, but you get punished for using it for seemingly no reason. If you bump a wall while running, you get bonked and take damage. Not only are you stopped dead in your tracks, but you lose health and can even die. Why? Why? Genuinely why? The game punishes you for not moving miserably slowly at all times. Looping back to Twinsen's weapon, the magic ball is a neat idea on paper. It's a ball that bounces off wall and moderately hurts enemies on contact. Not enough, mind you. Most enemies take 6 or 7 hits, and you only get to throw about once every 3 seconds between the ball leaving your hand, bouncing around a couple times, and returning. Beyond that, landing hits is dreadful. Aiming in an isometric game that has some 20-ish angles of aiming, and it's never clear where you're actually facing because you can only tell by looking kind of to the right of where Twinsen is looking. You're just wasting a lot of time throwing the ball. It misses, it comes back, you rotate slightly, you hope you hit. Sometimes you just can't get the right angle and have to readjust yourself. And the second the ball hits for the first time, you start getting shot. It should be fun to use, but it really never is. There's never any clever moments with it where you have to bounce it around corners or do anything like that. It's just a really, really bad gun. Why does this game even have combat? It's overly simplistic and miserable, and I've never seen another adventure game that even attempts it, probably for good reason, or fails as spectacularly as it, although I guess there is something to be said for trying something novel. It's miserable, and the game constantly throws enemies on every screen that kill you in seconds. It makes exploring in a game primarily about exploring completely miserable. The live system really doesn't help. The game constantly feels like it wants to waste your time. For every clover in your inventory, you get another life, which lets you respawn at the screen you died on. But even if you run out, progress you made is saved. You're just sent further away. So you need to traverse several dangerous screens to resume whatever puzzle you were on. It's just pointless and tedious, especially on puzzles that aren't saved regardless, like the horribly long and tedious platforming puzzle in the Temple of Boo, where regardless of if you just die or game over, you start the entire puzzle over every single time, which makes it a miserable, stressful endurance slog. The weirdest part? This is basically where my complaints end. If the game didn't have combat and maybe controlled a bit better, or was just like a point-and-click game, I think it'd be a pretty good entry-level adventure game. I was definitely getting lost, but I think you get enough hints and pointers from talking to people, and puzzles are usually logical enough that it never feels completely miserable to walk around and figure out what you need to do next, which is a bit of a rarity for the genre at this time. Dialogue can go on a bit long, and there's definitely some issues with navigating, but my frustration exclusively came from everything around the actual adventure game parts. No wandering around pixel hunting, no trying every inventory item on every person, just being told what you need to do and working out how to do it from context clues and memorizing and exploring. On a more positive end, the game is nice looking for its time, in some ways. The models themselves have largely aged a bit poorly. Twinsen himself especially looks pretty rough, like a waxy butterman, but the game is extremely well animated, smooth, full of little details. Each of Twinsen's forms have their own perfectly animated walk cycles with tons of animation frames, and pretty much every character that appears in the game has way more animation frames than they have any right to as well, and AI packages to facilitate all these animations. Most of the characters don't look nearly as bad as Twinsen either, because a lot of them are like anthropomorphic animals, which doesn't hurt. There's lots of little details in enemy patrol routes and idols. It's an impressive effort and helps immerse you into the world, as do the many interesting environments. There's definitely a little bit of jank, like Twinsen becoming low poly when he gets in the dune buggy because of really strict polygon limits, but I think it's hard not to appreciate how lively and animated everything in the world is. I have pretty much nothing to say about the music. Music is definitely not my field. It's not that bad, it's just kind of, it goes for that cinematic thing where you got some quiet, ambiatic orchestral pieces that are nice enough to listen to and can set the mood in some places but don't really stick with you after, you know what I'm saying? On the other end of the spectrum, the voice acting and sound effects border on comical.
What are you doing there? Who are you?
I'm fixing the antennas.
Every voice actor, especially Twinsen, sounds perpetually confused, like they're just kind of throwing question marks at the end of everything and they have no clue what the words they're saying mean. Accents and cadence are also all over the place. One second you'll meet a squeaky-voiced Irish rabbit, and then you'll run into one that sounds like he just came out of the Russian gulag. Sound effects are another thing that just tend to be fucking annoying. The drum sounds over Twinsen's walking is funny for 5 seconds, but gets old really quick, especially in discrete mode, and you just have to hear the drums for 4 minutes while crossing a single room. And that's before getting into all the weird sounds Twinsen tends to make. Whenever you get hurt, he goes over and over because you're going to get hurt over and over. and you just want to kill the little bastard. The sound design is a mixed bag, I guess you could say. There's a certain charm to the fact that I know that all these people are just the developers. Or, well, maybe not the developers in the English localization, but just some random people that they had at the Activision office. It doesn't make for the most pleasant listening experience. As a story-based game, I kind of need to fill in the background first, I suppose. LittleBigAdventure takes place on the planet of Twinsen, not to be confused with Twinsen, where an evil scientist, Dr. Funfrock, has taken over the world with clones and teleportation technology he invented. The only hope of stopping him comes from a legend about his downfall, and although he spent a lot of time hiding all traces of the legend, our hero Twinsen has been having prophetic visions leading to him being jailed at the start of the game. The jail is both a great and terrible intro. On the one hand, it forces you to explore the various forms, which is the most complex part of the game. And the clones you fight aren't really a pain compared to everything else in the game. On the other hand, the game really doesn't bother to explain anything, and getting spotted sends you back to the cell, where you need to slowly wait for the guard to come, beat him up, slowly wait for the platform to carry you out to the other guards to fight them, go to the locker to get your stuff, sneak past the guy. If you don't know what you're doing and you're trying to figure out the, frankly, a little overly complex controls, it gets tedious pretty fast, and even when you escape, certain enemies can send you all the way back here. To do this whole tedious tutorial over and over and over and over, I think I probably did it like 15 fucking times. Even upon escaping, you have the tedious task of waiting for the garbage truck to arrive, and then getting in it, and then waiting for it to leave, and then there's a cutscene of it driving somewhere else, and then it dumps you out, and then you have to run into the town, and then you fuck up one single time and you get sent all the way back to the jail. The first chapter of sorts is basically an exploration of the first island. Ultimately, you need to reach Twinsen's house to find the magic ball and watch his girlfriend get captured. Although if you don't hide good enough, you get sent back to the prison. I did, of course. To leave the island requires a boat, and getting a ticket involves the shittiest block puzzle I've ever seen. You can push these things 1 inch too far and be forced to reset because there's no way to go and rescue them. Use athletic form to get it done in a reasonable time, and you risk multiple resets, plus random damage at times. And if you use the normal form, it takes an eternity, but you're moderately less likely to make horrible mistakes. Chapter 2 is more interesting in terms of what's going on, leaving the tutorial, but also has many more enemies to make it tedious. The adventure game elements are much stronger here, with clues leading you all over. The astronomer can be found through a network of secret passages, and he directs you to the library, which has a censored materials section with information on the legend, although access is gated, and the rabbit here offers to let you look if you can make the city water taste better. There's also this nice guy up here who tells you about movies.
Good day. I'm looking for a friend.
I'd like to help you, but I really don't know much, except I'm a huge Star Wars fan. The saga sequel should be released soon, so I already reserved my seat in the movie theater.
They let you buy tickets 5 years in advance back then? Imagine waiting 5 years to be disappointed by The Phantom Menace. Have fun, buddy. The water clue leads you to the water tower, where Twinsen can poison the city's water supply with cherry cough syrup obtained on the first island. It doesn't come up again. Not really. I can't tell if it's really funny or really dark, or the game kind of goes to some goofy, weird places. The pharmacy on this island directs you to where to get cherry cough syrup if you missed it, so there's never that absolute moment of tediously wandering about both islands, and the game is generally pretty good about this. For the most part, I find that it strikes a pretty good balance of leaving you with enough to figure out on your own, and also making sure you're not just stuck for hours. After poisoning the entire island, the book directs Twinsen to a small desert island, which immediately starts with platforming. Oh joy. The island hosts the Temple of Boo, a long-last temple that holds another piece of the secrets to stopping Funfrock, and also holds a lot of suffering. All 3 rooms of the temple are terrible, and not so coincidentally, all 3 reset on death. Not just game over. If you lose before completing their puzzle, the puzzles reset. Although thankfully each one does save on completion. The first room is the worst by far, a platforming segment while being pursued by a skeleton that dodges the magic ball and takes a dozen hits to kill when you do land it, then a gauntlet of traps and obstacles that kill you in seconds, then pushing a block through those obstacles, then fighting 2 more skeletons, then dodging fireballs. It takes like at least 5 or 6 minutes to complete one singular run, and any death makes it all roll back. I probably spent an hour on this room alone, and it sucks. It's a frustrating, repetitive slog because the Indiana Jones vibes it has could have been really cool if it was pulled off better. The lack of any music doesn't really help it either. Room 2 is a fast-paced platforming chase away from a rolling boulder with obstructive foreground elements, from an isometric angle of course, as everything in this game is. It's frustrating and never feels like your fault if you fall, and if you fall you have to do a bunch of combat to get back out, or just save and load to skip all that and try the real shit part again. The last room is the least bad in that it's not dangerous, it just requires tedious platforming on narrow beams. As far as I could find, it's impossible or at least extremely difficult to perfectly align to walk down them, which means stopping every few steps to readjust or being forced to do it all again. And in the end, Twinsen gets the Book of Boo, which upgrades the magic ball to do more damage. Lets Twinsen talk to animals and read certain stone pillars around the world for hints to later objectives. One such readable object is in the cave under Twinsen's house. His ancestor... oh god... Higisepi? Jeez, French people, stop it. Was killed by the pirate Leborg, and lost the key to some useful stuff locked in the cave. For the next stretch of game, every NPC you talk to, Twinsen will harass with questions about some dead pirate. A question so obnoxious it just breaks NPCs sometimes. He just doesn't want to deal with me, does he? At the dock, a guy points you to Principal Island, where the ship owner says he sold it to the library. So you go there to read it, so you can get directed to Proxima Island. At this point, you need to buy the catamaran, a boat that effectively gives you fast travel to go anywhere you please, whenever you need, at least on the south hemisphere of the world. Although you need to grind up 200 coins by robbing the library repeatedly. 25 gold in the register. Talk about late fees. Proxima's Naval Museum has a whole exhibit for Liborn. Try to enter, the cops are called. A switch in the prison can set off an alarm in the museum, evacuating it, but setting sensors on the floor that detect you if you walk on it. This of course means finding stuff to use to get around it. A red keycard to open the museum's side entrance and the proto-pack. A jetpack you get in town that adds another movement option, although it is rather slow. The actual heist is pretty cool. You need to dodge roaming turrets who can shoot you to the ground, and as you can't remain stationary with the jetpack, you need to plan ahead a bit to get the key. It's not as annoying as the Desert Dungeon, but an interesting little challenge that plays into the game's less traditional adventure aspects. Back in the cave, Twinsen gets the third level of magic, the ball still sucks to use but does moderately more damage, and Golly's Horn, an item that can break certain walls, as well as information about 3 runic stones in the world. 2 on Proxima Island that can be activated, one of which further gives the magic flutes. This pretty much wraps up the pirate stuff. You can return to the desert and use the horn to meet Joe the Elf, sealed away forever for his bug crimes. I love when this game gets goofy instead of being a game. Finding him gives you membership to the Elf Club. You do need this eventually, to open a door, because some doors are locked with the Elf Club key. It's funny, I guess. Much of the world from here is pretty unnavigable, but Rebellion Island opens up by using the Jolly Roger flag that can also be stolen from the museum. With all this established, it's time to journey to the Northern Hemisphere. Funfrock claims it's a wasteland full of mutants, but be that as it may, it's also where the final stone lies. There's only one path to get there though, through the Hamalayi Mountains. The rebels want to rescue some prisoners of war up that way anyway, so agree to lend support. It's an all-out war, and that means a lot of this game's unpleasant combat. This whole chapter, so to speak, is almost nothing but, sometimes with fun twists, sometimes without. It starts fairly strong with you leading an AI companion up to a base in the mountains. He's a fairly competent fighter, and if he survives, you get to skip the last half of the journey by hijacking a tank and rolling up blasting. Sadly, you don't get to be the one driving, although I'm aware that LittleBigAdventure 2 added some driving stuff. This leads into the less pleasant chunk, invading the lab to destroy the eggs. You really feel how terrible the combat is when you get stun-locked to death the second an opponent shoots you, while you bounce the stupid ball off them 2 to 6 times. After destroying the eggs, the chief of Rabby Bunny City allows you to go further, where you fight another handful of enemies, all to get to the boat on the Northern Hemisphere, as well as the 4th and final level of magic. A lot of fodder enemies start dying in one hit with this, but that doesn't make aiming any less clunky, and it doesn't make the ball combat any less tedious. Well, the boat all the way back here can take you to a few new areas. They're all dead ends until you return to the desert. That requires a really fun walk back through all the combat areas you just went through, repopulated with enemies. You reach the desert and have to go through that platforming section again, or you can use the proto-pack to kinda skip it, but if you get shot, you instantly die. Then you trade the flute for the space guitar that a rabbit man found in a meteor. Some real old school adventure game type stuff. And no, you can't do this until you get the 4th magic level, because you need the flute to get that. The 4th magic level, by the way, that you get right next to the boat that could take you to the next area. Then once you have the space guitar, you walk all the way to the boat, all the way through all that shit you just went through for a third time. Somehow this manages to be the most tedious thing in the game by far. Just endless combat back and forth across the same path for an hour. It's not like you do anything fun or interesting on Tippet Island either. You murder 2 criminals, give a guy the space guitar, and shit about in the sewers with a bunch of crabs and snakes. The city is kind of cool with nice theming on the sewer city thing, but it's kind of just more straightforward combat hallways to reach the Dino Fly, the dragon thing that can actually fly you to places where things happen in this game. The game is essentially on a death spiral from here, if I'm being honest. Combat is almost entirely the sole focus of the rest of the game, and most adventure aspects are pretty well dead. The immediate goal is to shut down the teleportation center. Returning to Principal Island is kinda neat. You've walked past the Funfrock HQ hosting it dozens of times at least, so finally entering it is a neat payoff. Although I was out of gas and had to run all over the world farming money to actually start this shit. Probably my own fault, but I was still kind of irritated about it. To be only a touch reductive, the entire headquarters is combat. You need to fight like 8 dudes to get in, you fight like 6 or 7 more inside, destroy some machines, and that's kinda it. At a certain point you meet Funfrock before he immediately runs away, but you get the magic saber. Generously, I can describe it as the game's least shit weapon. It has moderately more range than the bare hands, swings in a wider arc, and attacks way faster. The ball is usually safer, but requires a lot of extremely tedious aiming and takes a lot longer. The saber isn't perfect. Being a melee weapon, you need to approach first, and clunkily shift from athletic mode to aggressive to swing, and rapid-fire ranged weaponry shreds Twinsen as he approaches, but relatively it's less tedious than the ball and better for most enemies. Usable, but mediocre, which is a step above your other options. The teleportation center isn't much different from the headquarters. It looks like every Funfrock base, and it largely consists of fighting guys. Knocking out the teleporters also has a fairly neat interaction with the rest of the world. Teleporters are broken and enemies won't spawn from them at all anymore, making certain areas substantially easier. There certainly wasn't anything like that for the Clone Factory, so it's an appreciable bit of effort for world building and makes a few areas more tolerable for it. And then with all that shit done, it's endgame time. The only place left to go is Fortress Island. Despite the name, a fortress hasn't really been built yet. After a brief sewer segment, you find Twinsen's girlfriend Zoe, or an evil clone of her that gets you captured and locked in a jail identical to the one from the start of the game. While the escape is basically the same, you can see a clone Twinsen in a cell, which is kinda interesting implication-wise, that Funfrock wanted to use him to take the runic stones. Most of it is construction yards with some unique construction-themed enemies, which is kinda neat. Shovel melee dudes, jackhammer guys with guns, and invincible trucks and plows that patrol the area trying to run you down. Most of the enemies can thankfully be avoided by running wide since the area is pretty open, and the less combat the better really. But it's still an area with very little adventure stuff and a decent bit of combat up to the end. Getting through all that leads to the Well of Sendell, the ultimate goal of Funfrock. The climatic battle is actually pretty cool. Funfrock is undamageable, but takes knockback from the sword and needs to be forced off a ledge. It's more creative than most of the combat in this game, and thankfully the sword swings so fast, Funfrock poses almost no challenge. You're more likely to accidentally keep swinging and drown yourself. I would know because I did. The second fight with him is substantially lamer as you just hold down attack until he explodes. Like I said before, he basically poses no threat to you because he can't attack fast enough, so you kill him very fast and it's over. Then you waltz into the well. Sendell looks kinda neat, it's a weird ancient alien thing, but the story wrap-up isn't narratively very interesting. Sendell tells you it planted a lineage of heroes to protect the Earth, and the day is saved. The game also tells you that if you hadn't saved the Sendell, who were aliens planted in the core of the Earth, then the Earth would have exploded for some reason. It kind of feels like this is something they should have told you earlier to up the tension, instead of after the fact, after you've prevented that. It's not much of an ending, like defeating Funfrock and destroying his operation is, and it's kind of nice to see the aftermath where everything is a lot more peaceful and people are, celebrating and free, but the Sendell stuff is like this weird lore fluff before Twinsen and Zoe are just teleported to the post-Funfrock party. It feels like the Sendell stuff probably should have come earlier somehow, like been reworked and had like the ticking clock element of the exploding planet somewhere else so you actually knew that was going to happen. It's a little clunky to just kind of backload the most important elements of the story. To wrap things up, I guess I would say LittleBigAdventure is one of the oddest games I've ever played. I find the game endearing and charming, the dialogue is silly and fun, the world is cute, and the creatures and designs, a little bit low fidelity in the modeling department, make the game pretty fun to explore. My biggest problem is the game. I dreaded turning it on every time, knowing that instead of interacting with the charming and cute world and exploring and finding secrets and trying to work out where I was supposed to be, I'd spend most of my time trying to aim an unwieldy ball and going through the same 5 rooms 9 times because I lost in clunky, miserable combat. In a normal adventure game, you get a lot of bullshit instant death traps, but once you know they're there, you can mostly avoid the bad fates. LittleBigAdventure never escapes feeling like a coin flip. Every battle can be an instant end, even against garbage enemies, as they stun lock you into oblivion and suck you in with their reverse knockback, and that's before you get to the isometric platforming stuff and getting hurt by running. It's a slow, clunky, and awkward experience that drags down a charming and cute world. One I often found myself literally sprinting past to avoid the annoying parts, where I would have loved to have just walked around and explore had the game more traditionally fallen into an adventure game mold. For its time, I mean, it's rough today, but it doesn't look terrible, and it clearly tried to push the envelope in a lot of ways and take lots of risks and new steps with the adventure game genre, as well as being a little bit more accessible for people who weren't into the point-and-click thing. And hell, I mean, you know, the music is generally nice, the sound effects aren't, but it has good aspects. It's like every single element of this game works pretty decently except for the fact that it's a video game. I hate playing it, but I wish I didn't, simply because it's pretty adorable. Perhaps someday I'll return to LittleBigAdventure, and I'll see if the sequel cleans stuff up, but for now, LittleBigAdventure will remain an awkward, interesting, charming, and frustrating oddity that I'm sure I'll look on more fondly the further I get away from having to actually play the game. A fondness around everything but the actual game itself.